Okay, I call to order the City of Plymouth Planning Commission meeting. Could we start with a roll call?
No.
Ashley said she was having trouble with her audio. Let me go ahead and go through.
All right,
Haley Green,
Here.
Van Hunsaker,
Here.
Darlene Rose,
Here.
Gianna Bernardini,
Here.
Joseph Sullivan,
Here.
Van Hunsaker.
Here again.
You guys moved. Peggy Yoder.
Here.
And from the City Council, Ruth Kazi, and from staff, Chair Gary Connor.
yep. Here,
And from staff, City Manager Chris Workman, and Ashley Howe is here with us as well.
okay, thank you. First order of business is minutes from January 4th. And I will start with one comment there. It says that we discussed replacing the word citizen with community member and that we decided to keep citizen throughout the draft. But what I see is that we, in some places, have the word resident, but I'm a little confused and not really remembering super well when that happened. Is that pertinent to these minutes? Gianna?
I was going to say the same thing. I remember having the discussion. I don't remember deciding that. I mean, maybe we did, but I didn't.
Well, the current version has the word citizen and has the word resident in one specific location. So I think in order to be accurate, the minutes should say that to keep the word citizen in most locations and change it to resident in that one specific section.
So we decided we didn't want community member.
I believe community members not in the current version, so I don't think we did.
No, I know, but there was a suggestion that we change from citizen to community member. But did that idea get, I remember Van didn't like it. I don't remember anything.
Yeah, that got denied. But we changed citizen to resident in some places.
Okay.
So is that a clear enough discussion, or do we need any more explanation on that one? And it's the in the section going forward where it talks about residents rather than citizens. Yes.
I think the best way to handle this, we'll just capture that in the minutes for this meeting, that there's a distinction of at least a couple instances where a resident was retained. I think that was in the, I'm not sure, I'd have to go back and look, but either that was new language or there's a specific reason that resident was used instead of citizen. The overall statement was, do we want to change every place that it's called out as citizen to resident or community member, something else? And that decision was no, we don't want to just do a blanket change, but there are uses of the term resident still throughout the document where it wasn't changed. That was the original word that was used.
That's fair. That's fair. Ashley, is that sufficient for the minutes for this meeting? So we can just say that when we approve the minutes, we discuss that residence is used. All right, thank you. Any other comments on the January 4th minutes?
I'll move that we approve them. January 4th, 2022 minutes.
We have a second?
I'll second it.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Were you in favor? Yeah, I guess, as we said last time, I learned that silence means you're in favor. So unanimous. Thank you. Now, January 19th.
Gary,
Yes.
I would like to ask a question that could be reflected in these minutes about the January 4th minutes. And that is, it's just a question on second page, line 96, 97, 98. And it says Counselor Causey suggested that perhaps a planning commission mailbox might function better as a means for community member input. That's when we were talking about individual mailboxes. And I was wondering, what would be the next step for that? Is that going to happen? Is it not going to happen? Does it need to go through the city council? Is it something that needs to go through the city council? I just don't want it to see it just go by the wayside. I don't know who to ask.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was in the context of discussing the citizen involvement. So, you could take the slow boat approach and just let the citizen involvement chapter happen and then make changes thereafter. But I suppose that's something that we could talk about moving forward sooner. Commissioner Causey, do you have any comments on that?
No, but I think Mr. Workman has a comment.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Chris.
I should say if that's an item the planning commission wants to take up, I think we'd put it on the agenda and have a discussion about it and make a formal recommendation to the city council.
Okay.
Great.
So the minutes will show that we're requesting that an upcoming agenda include the discussion of a mailbox for the planning commission.
Thank you.
So back to January 19th, any comments? Do we have to move in to have a second for approval of minutes, or can we just vote?
Should have a motion in a second, yeah.
All right,
Okay, I'll move we approve the Plymouth Plan Commission minutes from January 19th.
I'll second.
all in favor? Aye,
Aye.
it's unanimous, thank you. So our new business is the housing policy discussion. And I'll start off by saying that I was pretty overwhelmed by the enormity of everything. And that's nobody's fault. It's just a big issue. It's probably, I guess, in my mind, one of the biggest issues we could discuss. And I'll point out that I don't know if everybody read their water bill newsletter insert that came in the last day or so. But what's listed in there is a little bit different than what we've discussed previously about our schedule. Previously, our schedule had us discussing the housing chapter this week and then having a public hearing next week. But what that newsletter said is that we discuss it this week and shouldn't say next week, the next meeting, this meeting and the following meeting, and then possibly a public hearing on March 1st. And I think that's absolutely in order, considering the number of things to consider. And I think we should spend a few minutes discussing the process about that and what the contents of the packet that we were given and where they came from, just to get on the same page, because I spent a fair bit of time looking through it just to comprehend what everything was and where it came from. And I know we've got some new members, so I think just discussing that is probably very worthwhile here at the beginning, and then maybe kind of an overall discussion of what we hope to accomplish with the housing chapter before we dive in, so we don't get crossways on what we're even trying to accomplish. Does that make sense to everybody? And Chris, I guess we didn't discuss it, but are you ready to launch into that sort of a discussion? I can.
Absolutely, yep.
Great, thank you.
So I'm on my agenda item summary where I kind of try to pitch this a little bit, and I didn't try to add even more narrative where it wasn't necessary, but just try to lay these out. So looking through these, we have the housing chapter, which is chapter 3 in the city's comprehensive plan. So that's the next chapter that we're doing, specific to housing. The city recently contracted with Echo Northwest to come in and do a housing needs analysis for the city. That's been completed, reviewed, and that's been adopted by the city council. So that's an appendix to the comp plan right now. I don't know what appendix letter it is, but it's attached to the comprehensive plan as an appendix and a supporting document. And so just going back to my agenda and summary, what we provided you to review and kind of get everybody up to speed a little bit is the current housing chapter out of the city's current comprehensive plan. You'll note that it reads very much like a housing needs analysis. The synopsis on that was back in 1998. The COG, Council of Governments, got a grant from Department of Land Conservation Development to do a regional housing needs analysis. And so they got the federal fund or the state funds, and they did it for our entire region. And then what our consultant did is they looked at that regional study that was done and pulled out the Plymouth specific stuff as much as possible. And that's what all got included in our current chapter 3 of the comprehensive plan, our housing chapter. And so yep, go ahead, Gary.
Just for clarity, so everybody's on the same page, that's the document that starts with housing with a 3 on top.
Yep. So that's our current, that's chapter 3 housing. So again, it's going to read very much like our housing needs analysis does. And talking with some consultants that we're working with on a different project, similar project, a code audit, their recommendation and what we're seeing more and more is that as cities are updating their comprehensive plan, they're doing what we've done up to this point is they adopt the study as an appendix. And then the chapter dealing with housing in this example has a fairly short narrative, maybe a page or 2 of introduction, and then it just lists out the policies and the objectives and goes through that way. So we're not going to have another housing chapter, or my proposal would be we will not have another housing chapter that's 17 pages long. It's going to be a page or 2 of narrative, and then another 2 to 3 pages of actual, or 1 to 3 pages of actual policies and objectives that we're gonna shoot for, in a similar layout to what we did in the first chapter, the citizen involvement chapter, where it's a little more bullet point and a little bit less just narrative and data and tables and all the information, which is what we currently have in chapter 3. Go ahead, Gary.
Can I just jump in there?
Mhm.
So like in the citizen involvement previous chapter, we couldn't really amend it because it was too short and kind of went a different direction. This one's on the other extreme. It's too long, and I think it would be really hard to make changes to this. And I think it's probably easier to start over. So when I read it, I kind of tried to see if there was anything really worth saving. And I think that might help us as we start to discuss this and it doesn't even have to be today, but I think we should, if anybody feels like there's something worth saving in there, that's something that I'd expect to hear from people. As we just go through a process that doesn't take too long.
Yeah, the way I would look at it is that the housing needs analysis essentially is replacing all of the data that is currently in chapter 3. That's now an appendix. At the end of chapter 3, the last page, I think it's page 17, it actually lists the policies, and they're very succinct. I don't remember the exact number of them. 9 of them. So page 17, there's 9 housing policies. We're actually going to, if what's been proposed by the consultant is that we're actually going to expand on these 9, and instead of 1 page of 9 kind of 1 sentence policies, we're actually going to expand these policies out, add some objectives to them. And so, instead of 1 page of policy, we're actually going to have like maybe 2 or 3 pages of policy, but all the supporting documentation is going to go to the appendix, not in as part of the chapter. So that's kind of what's swapping out. So I would say this last page, the policy page, that's going to be the one that we'll hopefully even look at tonight to see where there's some similarities between what's in the existing policies and what's in some of the recommended policies where the language is just tweaked, but really the subject matter is going to be fairly similar on some of these. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. So that's the first document they were given, was the current housing chapter. The next document you got was the Plymouth housing strategy. And I believe that's what it says right on the top of it.
Yep.
So, yep, thank you, Gary. So this is the document that has the actual proposed policies and objectives based on the findings in the housing needs analysis. Now, I'm going to put a pin right there and just say the housing needs analysis was completed by the consultant, reviewed and approved. But even that approval was kind of with this acceptance that it's not perfect. There's some things in there that maybe are overstated or maybe oversimplified or maybe overcomplicated. Or there may be things that the findings of which we may not necessarily agree with as a community, and we may want to do something different than what the consultant recommended. That's okay. And part of this task that this group will be doing is to look at where does the housing needs analysis and the findings and the recommended policies say go this direction, and we as a body, or you as a body, feel like we really should be going a different direction, and then we need to base that on something. So that may be a little bit more work, which is okay. But part of that will be deciphering. We don't just want to take the whole pill as is. There's definitely some areas where we can dissect it a little bit more and really zero down on specific recommendations on whether or not as a community we agree with that or we don't agree with that, right? So, but my intent and my hope that for this evening, a lot of our time is spent in the Plymouth housing strategy document, and that we use it kind of like we did with the Monroe and the Dallas communications or citizen involvement chapters, and that we can kind of split and dice which of these sections do we like, which of them do we not like as much, are there things missing we need to add in, but that we kind of use this Plymouth housing strategy as the working document of kind of the new chapter 3. Obviously with a page or two of introduction, I can show you some examples. And we've got an example in the packet from Monroe on the narrative that they provided as well. So just put a pin that just to show you the other documents that were provided and given a quick explanation of those, and we maybe come back, answer questions, and then come back to that Plymouth housing strategy document. The other you were given a full copy of the housing needs analysis. That's all the data. Again, that's an appendix right now. We'll look for there for findings. Okay, we'll look for there for summaries, recommendations, those types of things. But for the most part, that's the data set that we'll be looking to and relying on, recognizing that we may not as a body necessarily agree with all of those findings, right? But that's the data set in a whole that we're relying on, right? So that's that document. And it is meant to read kind of as a reference more than a novel, right? We'll reference back to specific sections of that document as needed and ignore other sections that aren't as applicable when we're dealing with other sections. So next you got the housing policy alternatives. This document actually wasn't going to include in the packet because there's a lot to it that's less applicable. And it looks like I don't even have my copy. It's one that looks like it has all the tables. Thank you, Gary. So housing policy alternatives. And if you flip a couple pages, Gary, to show kind of the table. So that's what's most identifiable about that one. It's kind of the chart. So this is a list, as it kind of explains, of other policies or objectives that the city may be interested in. They just weren't necessarily either a high priority based on the housing needs analysis, or they just weren't a recommendation from the consultant to be transferred in as policies or objectives in the Plymouth housing strategy. So
And
go ahead, Gary.
Can I comment? A lot of them seem to be very specific as well, that maybe don't necessarily belong in a housing chapter of the comprehensive plan, like verbatim in any way, but would maybe be things that you could reference in the housing chapter so that you could say, it would be good for the city to pursue these types of policies or these types of programs, and then list the titles of those from here, as
Yeah.
opposed to, saying in our comprehensive plan that we need to pursue some, very specific parcel assembly or, anything else that's listed in here.
Right. Yeah, that's very good. In fact, I'd recommend, as we're going through the Plymouth Housing Strategy document and we're looking at those policies and objectives, as we're going through there, as we get to the end, if there's things that weren't captured that are important to you or that you feel like the community should be engaged in, maybe it's you feel like the objectives and policies don't address tiny homes, and you think that that's the cat's meow and we really need to address tiny homes. If you go to that alternative section, there's actually a full write-up on tiny homes, and it talks about steps that the city could take to look more and develop and kind of flesh out the idea of tiny homes more and come up with some type of policy that you could then implement. So it's not intended to be the policy, it's just other ideas of other types of policies and types of things that the city could consider if it wanted to. So they're not direct recommendations from the consultant, but the consultant provided them to us as alternatives. These are if you think of it, this is kind of the toolbox that the consultant's using when they go into any given community. And then based on what that community's analysis looks like and what they're hearing from the community, they're going to pull these different tools out and put those in and implement those as the actual proposed or recommended objectives and policies. In our case, that's what they did. And these are just the tools that didn't necessarily get used, right? They're still in the toolbox, but they didn't transfer over into recommended policies and objectives for whatever reason, right?
And personally, what I was thinking my approach to this would be, because it's too big of a bite to swallow in one go. I was thinking we would tonight be focusing on the higher level issues and kind of see where we get. And then once we kind of have a rough outline about what's there, I was going to spend some time before the next meeting going back and looking at these alternatives and seeing if any of them deserved some more attention in my mind for the comprehensive plan.
I think it's a good strategy, Gary, would be focus on the housing strategy tonight specifically, digest it a little bit, and then read through the alternatives and see if there's something there that you feel like isn't addressed in the housing strategy or we need to add to. I think that's a good way to go about it. And then the last one, I apologize, this didn't get labeled very good on the first page, but this was the Monroe housing policies. I think it's in the footer, and I apologize, it's not right up on front, but yeah, housing goals and policies. This isn't their entire chapter. They do have several pages of narrative. Before this, actually probably have more narrative in there than what I would envision we would want for ours. They kind of extrapolate a lot of stuff from their housing needs analysis and carried quite a bit of that into their document. But it does provide a sample of kind of the layout for policies and objectives, similar to what we would be looking to do or similar to what has been proposed for us. So hopefully that's helpful. Before we get too far, I think it might be helpful here if I just give you a couple other examples besides the Monroe example, so you can get an idea of kind of layouts of the documents, but maybe questions first on specific documents.
There was one more in here, just to note that.
Oh, yep, sorry. So goal 10 housing. This is the language directly out of Department of Land Conservation Development. These are kind of minimum requirements for the housing section. This is part of what the consultant's role was make sure that the policies and objectives that they've recommended meet these kind of minimal criteria. So we'll be reviewing this. This will be part of my staff review when we make a formal recommendation to the council. The staff review is going to make sure that we have covered everything that we're required to recover at the state level. And not just when we get to the council. When we get to a kind of final draft version for you, that'll be part of my review at the staff levels to make sure we're compliant with state kind of minimum qualifications. But I don't foresee that being a problem. I think we'll more than exceed the minimum requirements.
Commissioner Yoder.
Yes, I was wondering with the older version, the one that was in 1998, is there any risk of not going through it thoroughly if there's something important that might be missed that is kind of carried over into the newer one? Or do we want to just, cut it and say, okay, this is where we're going to start afresh? I think Gary's the one that said that. Or should we give a certain amount of time for input on the old housing chapter 3 that is going to go by the wayside? I just would hate to have us just say, okay, we're not going to use it anymore. It's out. It's old.
Yeah, I started by recommending that everybody read that and see if there's anything in there that you feel should be carried forward. A lot of it is just old data. So,
Right.
but I do recommend that we do that.
So that can still be up for a topic of discussion next time if we want to digest it a little bit more thoroughly than I have this time. So
Yeah, absolutely. Commissioner Bernardini.
Yeah, in that old chapter, I was struck by one particular statistic in there, which indicated that Plymouth and I think Monroe had by far the largest discrepancy between income level and housing cost over the span of that 10 years. Like it was dramatically, the discrepancy between income and median housing costs was gargantuan and almost unique aside from Monroe in the county. And that, to me, that was a fact. If that is still the case, that is a significant enough fact that I think we need to really consider that.
And that's the kind of facts that could be pulled into a chapter, to kind of in the introduction to justify what, the approach we're taking. And
I mean, it's one thing to say more affordable housing, but it's another to say this is why we're in deep trouble this way.
And I believe there's very similar statistics in our current housing needs analysis, or at least information that could be used.
Yeah. Before we get too far down the road, if I could go ahead and share my screen, I want to show you a couple of examples of other housing chapters from other municipalities. These were 3 that were sent to me from a consultant. We're setting the groundwork for a code audit in the future. And I mentioned that we were having a meeting this evening. So this morning he sent me these, or I had to send them to you earlier, but he just got these over to me this afternoon. And I just want to give you a little bit of perspective and looking at 3 examples that these documents are meant to be pretty high level and not overly complex, I guess. So there will be, well, let me show them to you and then you kind of see what I mean. So let me share my screen. This is screen 2. So this is the city of Sherwood, which is a little bigger now. So I'm not sure exact size. I think there may be 10 or 15,000 folks or so. I may be way off on that, but so here's kind of their narrative. They talk about their 2040 plan, their range, their current population makeup, aging population, current housing stock. So there's their first page. Recent housing needs analysis was completed from 2019 to 2039. As required by state law. This is what the H&A covers. It looks out 20 years. That's it. That's their narrative. And then they go right into goal 1. Goal 1 is preserve and enhance character of existing neighborhoods. Here's their policies. They have 10 policies on how they're going to do that, right? And then goal 2, well, sorry, they have 14. So 2 pages of that. Goal 2 has 5 policies. Plan new residential developments to integrate with existing Sherwood as complete neighborhoods where community members can live, learn, shop, and recreate. So that's their goal 2 with policies. Policy 2.3 kind of breaks out into some bullets. And then goal 3 with 6 policies attached to that. And that's it. That's their chapter. So, 3, 4, 5 pages. So again, we're at 17 pages of a lot of data, a lot of text. What we're seeing with the updated comp plans is that all that data gets put in the appendix, and this is really meant to be pretty high level on setting some goals and some policies. Let me show you North Plains. Here's their narrative. Pretty straightforward. Again, the text is text. I'm happy to send these to you. In fact, they'll be part of the document now that I'm sharing them in the meeting, but pretty straightforward language on introduction. Where's where they currently have. They did their housing and needs analysis from between 2020, 2014 is when they were looking, or when they completed. They're looking at growth, future growth, going from an increase of 3,825 people between now and 2037. So that's their narrative. And then they get right into it, city objectives and policies. They've got an objective, 5 policies, second objective, 2 policies, a third objective with 2 policies, and a fourth objective with 5 policies. So again, pretty high level, right? We're not getting into a lot of detail on some of these, even these policies. Develop regulations to encourage development of low and moderate income affordable housing. That's the policy, right? We're not talking about how we're going to do that. We're not talking specifics of agencies we're going to work with, any of that. This is very high level. We're going to develop regulations to encourage development of low and moderate income affordable housing. And that's the policy level. So just an example. Then the last one I'll show you is Redmond, just for a size. Redmond's a very large city, Eastern Oregon. Well, relatively large, I guess, compared to Plymouth. Here's their narrative. I was kind of joking with staff earlier today. You could almost copy and paste this for any city because there's nothing really specific about Redmond in here. This is just, here's the state's requirements for our housing chapter, which is the same for everybody. And then they just go right in, have some nice photos, and then they go right into the goal 1 and a few policies. A little more detail in here. So you can get more detailed, identify barriers to infill, et cetera. They have a second goal, housing opportunity, 2 policies. And goal 3 is affordable housing. So that's a goal in and of itself, as opposed to just being a separate policy. That's a goal. And then they've got some policies to support that. So this one is a little bit longer. It's 11 pages. They've got 4 infrastructure planning, looking at plan out infrastructure, and then goal 5 for funding and how to fund everything. So this one's a little bit longer. Of all of them, this one's 11 pages. Obviously, they get into a little bit more detail here, which you can do. So again, just to give you some examples of, how simple these can be versus kind of even on the complicated side, what those would look like. So does that help? Any questions on these and just kind of perspective of what it is that we're kind of our end product could look like, what we're kind of shooting for?
Yeah.
Commissioner Yoder?
I do. So it makes me wonder, surely they have action items on how to accomplish some of these goals somewhere, or are you saying they don't even have those anywhere? Like,
So, yeah, so those are probably going to be found in like their strategic plan that the city councils looked at and approved. So it's fairly very likely that once this housing, the housing chapter is updated, the city council is going to look at that and set priorities for themselves for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out. And based on what's in the comprehensive plan, they're going to look at, what steps do they want to take to implement these housing policies. And so those are going to more than likely be found in a strategic plan or a master plan, or maybe goal setting. If it's a smaller community, they might just be doing annual goal setting. It would be captured there.
so is it fair for me to think that because it's not on what you had just shown us, it's somewhere, so all of a sudden the 15 pages of documents are going to be 30 pages of documents because it's going to include more of the action items of how you're going to reach those goals. Instead of having it be somewhere else, they're going to be together, or am I totally off?
Yeah, I think it's where it's going to go, right? Some of these are about, so it depends on how it's worded. If it's support efforts for low-income housing, for example, that might be one of the action items might be to do a code audit and look for areas within our municipal code that discourage low income affordable housing, right? So it's not necessarily going to be an action item on a other plan somewhere. It may be a task that staff does. It might be a priority that the city council takes. It may be an assignment that the city council asks the planning commission to look into further. If we're looking at rezoning areas for higher density housing, for example, that may be something that the planning commission is tasked with doing if that's a priority for the city council. I guess the point would be that those are going to change on a more regular basis. You wouldn't necessarily want to put those into the comprehensive plan, which is meant to last for 20 years, right? So those overall policies and objectives for those 20 years, you want to work towards those things, but you don't necessarily want it to be something you can check off the list in 6 months and now it's irrelevant because you've already done it and it was maybe too specific, right? That's probably something that's more appropriate in a strategic plan or an action plan of some sort.
But we still want to make it easily accessible. So when you're reading about a policy on affordability, that you see some of the recommendations of this is what you could do to make it more affordable instead of searching for it, but maybe not.
Yeah, I think we can be as detailed as we want to be, but I'd encourage us to keep this as kind of higher level. And once we get into the document, Commissioner Yoda, that might be helpful to see some of the recommended language there. Might help getting to what you're getting after.
Yeah, I think the purpose of our process right now is to be very high level and look at our goals, affordable housing and our policies around that. And if that, I feel like that is one large meal in and of itself. It takes a lot of bites, and that's what we're working on. What you're actually going to do once you have your chapter in place in the comprehensive plan, that's the next stage. And as far as those other cities, if they finished their comprehensive plan last week, there's nothing, that comprehensive plan is a thing in and of itself, high level, and all the detail is a completely separate process that I think we want to dabble in as we talk about this chapter, but we can't get too far into it because we're not tasked with doing anything along those lines now, unless it raises to the level of being part of our comprehensive plan for the next 20 years.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
Any other questions on kind of anything I've covered up to now? I know I've already thrown a lot at you. I gave you a bunch to read, and then I've kind of heat you up this first 40 minutes of the meeting or 30 minutes of the meeting with more information. But hopefully I'm trying to clarify the process and what it is we're trying to get to a little bit better for everybody. And if there's not any questions, then Gary, I'll kind of turn the reins to you to maybe walk us through the housing strategy document.
Yeah, definitely. I guess I'll say first off that I'm very eager to read those other plans and look at their top level goals. And
I have them here. If we want to reference them throughout, we can do that. That's why we provided the Monroe one, but I'm happy to pull these up. We can reference them throughout the meeting if that's helpful.
Yeah. I think that will be helpful, but I guess just the way I work, I'm going to be looking forward to just sitting down and reading them. So if we can make progress about the different kinds of goals that are available and kind of the policies that are in them and spend a little bit of time going through them, I guess we'll see where we get to, but I'm not going to be able to get to the point where I kind of comprehend all of that in one meeting tonight.
Yeah.
I'm going to want to spend some time with it before the next meeting for sure.
Ditto.
Yeah. So, you said, I guess where I'd like to start is the housing policies from the previous chapter. And I think some of these policies are completely applicable today and to this kind of format of a comprehensive plan chapter on housing, but some of them less so. I mean, and even if I guess they're just 9 policies, whereas all the other examples we see are our goals with some policies below that. And I know I always struggle to keep that distinction clear because, to me, a goal, so I think it's worth talking briefly about the difference between a goal and a policy. In my mind, a goal is what you want to accomplish, and a policy is how you accomplish it in the simplest manner. And these currently these policies are really specific, and I like putting them under goals. And so that's the first thing. I think we should follow that format. Certainly open to other thoughts, but in the old chapter, the first one is an adequate supply of buildable land, and that's certainly a policy. Residential land, number 2 is residential land shall be designated for either low, medium, or high density housing on the plan map. I'm not sure if that's really kind of the thing we're going for as a policy. That feels a little too specific, but I don't know.
Well, I agree, because I think a lot of the stuff when I don't remember which document it was that I was reading, but there are different ways to handle them, like
Right.
maybe considering upzoning or mixed use, and so that seems too specific.
Right. Commissioner Hunsaker.
I guess I would guess a little differ with you on going back first. These are housing strategies, or that document is what the comprehensive plan was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And the relevance, that's not how you say that.
Yeah.
Relevance, today may not be at all what is relevant. Now, I would suggest that we go to what's the draft from the consultant and go through that and decide if we want to keep all these or change them. And if there's some discrepancy, like Gianna, she was saying there was a discrepancy that she saw in the old one, that we can compare it to the old one, but not decide if the old ones are applicable today. And to me, that doesn't make sense to do that, where we already had this 50 or 60 page document produced in the housing needs analysis.
Yeah.
And then the strategies are based on that, not what was 20 years ago.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And honestly, my purpose in doing that is just to kind of talk about it briefly and then leave it behind unless somebody wants to bring it up.
Okay. All right. I'm all right. Okay.
And I don't need to go through every point. I just want to point out kind of the context. So as we work forward, when you do go back and look, there might be some wording there we want to keep. There's nothing wrong with some of it. But I guess my biggest thing was to point out that, to follow on to Chris's point, is I think some of these can be just left behind.
Okay.
Yeah, and some of it's wording. Again, a lot of these are going to be captured. Again, I think it's good to go through them and be refreshed on what the existing ones are. But again, I think you'll see bits and pieces of these in the recommended policies, because they are, we're not reinventing the wheel here. Plymouth is unique, but it's not that unique unto itself, right? Every city in Oregon has housing policies, and we're going to have some nuances and some little things, but for the most part, a lot of the great ideas have been had already, and we'll come up with some of our own, and then somebody else will copy it and it'll be in theirs and it'll roll through. So I guess my point being is a lot of these are going to sound very familiar. And if you pick up another city's housing policies, they're going to sound very familiar to ours, right? with some nuances. But these are typically, we're trying to set good policy for housing going forward, and they're going to be fairly similar to other communities.
Not hearing any other discussion on that, I can move forward into the housing strategy. And I'll be honest, the first page, 2/3 of the first page, I'm a little, I guess the middle of the first page talks about the difference between two types of affordable housing. And I guess that's useful, but that's not necessarily part of the strategy.
Yeah, I think this was intended, so this originally came to the Planning Commission, City Council as kind of a precursor to the, well, it was a document that was produced after the housing needs analysis was done, but it was really not meant for when the Planning Commission starts to talk about housing policies, here's your document to start with. So the first page of this, that first 2/3, like you said, it was really introducing the housing strategies and where we were at the time. We're not at the same place anymore, right? We've adopted the housing needs analysis. The housing is interesting information. It gives some background, but I agree. I don't think that this is the type of information we would want to start our policy, our actual chapter with. We'd probably look for something that was a little more specific to Plymouth and more general, I guess, and we're complying with the state's requirements.
Yeah. And then moving on, it talks about policies, objectives, and then actions. But this language is a little bit different than those examples that you had. The policy 1 is really kind of like all those examples use the word goal, right? And they use the policy. Those examples use the word policy more like they use the word action in this document. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, unfortunately, they get interchanged quite a bit. Let me pull up again real quick, just so you can see what Gary's talking about here. This is, again, so this was Redmond. So they have their goal listed as land availability, plan for a 20-year supply. And then their policy language is, ensure that there is sufficient land in each residential plan designation to meet the land needs identified in the housing needs analysis. That's the policy. And then this, I guess you would say, would be like an objective.
Yeah.
Is to rezone land addressed.
So that example on your screen is goal, policy, objective.
Right.
And the example we have from the housing needs analysis is policy, objective, action. So
Right. And the North Plain, they actually switch it and they do the objective is to do this. And then these are the policies. So they kind of interchange.
So we've got
objective with goal.
Three words that are, I guess, three words that are used interchangeably.
Yeah.
At different levels.
But since Echo Northwest used policies, objectives, and actions, it seems reasonable that we would continue on to use those since we are using their documents, correct?
I don't think there's any harm in it, just so long as we're referring to them the same way. And then the question would be, are the action items appropriate for the comprehensive plan, or would those action items be actual things that then would kind of roll over into a strategic plan, or that would fall off? Are these action items get this done this year kind of task? I mean, they're action items, tasks that you're going to do that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for the comprehensive plan, or do we want to include them in the comprehensive plan, which is kind of that next level down from the examples we've seen where they have the goals and the policies, or they have the objectives and the policies, but they don't necessarily drill down to an action item.
Commissioner Hunsaker.
Yeah, I guess I would suggest go ahead, use these terms. I can see that there's differences in how they're used, but I think if we start changing, at least at this moment, what's the policy objectives and action, where that goes, if we try and change that right now anyway, we might just make ourselves more confused. So I would just suggest go through them like they are. And even to the point of the actions, I understand what you're saying, Chris. I think we should just go through this like it is, how it's laid out, and determine if we're okay with it, with those items, and then, move on one by one. I mean, just like the policy one, ensure an adequate supply of land is available and serviced. I would assume we'd all agree that, yeah, that's a good policy, and just go on so forth, and see if if they fit, or we agree they fit, or no, this doesn't even make sense, or whatever. I think that would be useful for us to go through that. If you want us to say skip the actions at this point, maybe so, but so that we can, I mean, this is only 8 pages long. Even if we in the end decided to keep all of it in there, it wouldn't be that big of a document. But still understanding what you were saying about the action items, often you don't necessarily want them to be there, but where they're there at this moment, maybe leave them there.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Last thing that is, and it may just be, I think as Commissioner Hunsaker said, it's maybe something we can address later, maybe more of a formatting semantic issue than anything. I just pulled up our chapter 1 that we just looked at to see, well, what did we do in chapter 1? And maybe we should be consistent with chapter 1 when we get to chapter 3. And there we used the goal was like inclusion. Here, let me pull it real quick.
Oh.
So in there we did, here's our format for chapter 1. So it was goal was here, and then the policy 1.1.2. Goal 2 was stated, and then policy. So that was the format we used there, which again, we can go back and reformat and do that later. I think the text of the narrative is probably more important than the formatting at this point.
I guess I'll just say it right there. I have a preference for the word goal over the word policy. To me, a policy is, you have to fill out form 9 and 10 when you fill out form 7. Whereas a goal is what you're really trying to accomplish. I guess it's just clearer language to me. Is there any disagreement? Discussion?
It's clear.
All right. Maybe what we can do to start is just go through this Plymouth housing strategy and just talk about the, is it 4 policies? Yeah, the 4 policies, which I just propose that we call goals. And then maybe talk about what the goals are in the Monroe plan, and maybe the goals in some of the examples that Chris put up, just to start off with kind of getting, when I read all the way down to the detail on each one, that I feel like I lose the context. So if there's no other proposals, I'll just kind of very briefly summarize the goals policies in the Plymouth housing strategy, the 4. And the first one is ensure an adequate supply of buildable land. This is very much summarized. Number 2 is opportunities for housing to development to meet the city's identified housing needs. 3 is provide opportunities for development of housing affordable to all income levels. And 4 is identify funding sources to support the development of infrastructure and housing affordability programs. So to me, those 4 policies are supply of land, which is, something that's very obvious. The next one is opportunities for housing development. So that's about how easy it is to build. And then 3 is provide opportunities for affordable housing. And then 4 is identify funding sources for the development of affordable housing. Commissioner Bernini.
See, this is where I feel like the example that we got from Monroe, I thought was far superior to what we had. If what we're looking at is this high level kind of thinking, to me, the Monroe, there are 5 goals, I think 5, 6,
6.
where it says economically sustainable, socially sustainable, environmentally sustainable, density. They pull it down into some motivating principles, I feel like, that will drive their development, that I think, and I feel like their goals are much more inspiring and much more, to me, that feels like a vision for how they want their city to develop, as opposed to the ones we have here, which seem much more prosaic and much more like, let's make sure we have land. Let's make sure we can pay for it. I don't know. I just feel like as a guiding document, I feel like Monroe's was much more successful than the one we have here. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Commissioner Yoder.
That said, with so Gianna, are you thinking that to not disregard what Echo Northwest came out with, but just to put their information in a different format?
No, I guess I'm thinking more disregard. I mean, not disregard, but I'm thinking that some of those ones that Chris showed us and some of these other examples, if I understand the purpose of this document, to me, I would prefer something a little more aspirational in a sense about our concepts for how we want the city to grow.
Yeah, and
or our values as a town.
And I'll throw in my 2 bits. If I can summarize what the Eco Northwest goals here, to me, it's just saying, make sure that you can build things. And then the next 3 policy goals are affordable, affordable, affordable. And I agree with you completely. It doesn't seem as inspiring or as readable. And I think I like Monroe, but I was very much intrigued by a few of the examples that Chris showed on the screen. And I think there's a couple of different ways to do it. And I kind of agree with you, Gianna, that it'll be better if we can certainly pull from this. And Peggy, I definitely plan on, using some of the language and information. And we certainly have to reference it because it is an approved appendix. So I don't think it's appropriate to use the word disregard what they've done, but I think just frame it differently. Commissioner Sullivan.
Yeah, so Gianna, I'd be curious to know if you imagine we jump forward in time 10 or 20 years, and this document is now history and it's been used to set policy and guide the growth of Philomath. And let's just imagine, for the sake of discussion, that it's completely legal and meets all of the state requirements and all that boring stuff. But as far as like vision goes, Philomath 2040, what does it look like? Is it bigger? Is it smaller? Does it have like, and I'm just asking you personally, like what would you say your vision is for Philomath?
Well, I think that's part of the problem I'm having with this. I know what I would like to see, but I have no idea how that squares with the rest of you, much less the larger community. So
Yeah.
I know what I would want
Well,
to see. That
what would you like to see? I want to hear.
Can I
um,
can I pause there? I agree with you 100%, Joseph. I feel like the process that we're in kind of jumps us to go through this, and I would hope that we can merge the two so that we can both talk about what we do want to accomplish as well as what we want to put on paper about it. And it's and I think we should be talking about both, because if we don't, we can get caught in more of a quagmire of how to resolve the document when we haven't really talked about where we're at. So I agree with you 100%. And I would like to facilitate that kind of a discussion more than just Gianna.
Okay, well, if this isn't the right time for it, that's fine. But when
No,
that time is, I definitely, that's the discussion I'm really excited about.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I think he was saying it's just my opinion that really matters.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Actually,
I agree.
as chairman, my opinion matters too. And I'm thinking that I would benefit from a 5-minute break. And if that's okay with everybody.
I'm fine.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I'll think about how we move forward from there.
See you guys in 5 minutes.